Welcome to it. This is Free Media, Free Minds, and I am your resident host, Chelsea Noah Ogilvie. And this is the show that shows and doesn't just tell. And tonight, I'll be showing you around all the issues that threaten media freedom with a specific focus on representation of queer bodies and queer narratives and queer experiences within African media. I think that representation contributes to the construction of our own identities. So we'll look into how representation affects us when we don't have the representation, or how construction affects us when we don't have the representation that we need. All right, so in studio with us today is Leletu, and we'll introduce you to her in a moment. But before I do that, we will be joined in studio a little bit later by Annette from Love Matters. Welcome to it.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. How
Fantastic.
are you?
I'm good. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to give us a young breakdown, a young bio of who you are and what you do?
All right. So my name is Leletu Pisakwe. I am a social sciences researcher by profession. I specialize in public health, predominantly key populations, so women, children, adolescents, and queer persons as well, and how they basically navigate certain aspects of public health. I also focus predominantly on tuberculosis and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. But I'm here at this capacity today as the creative director for Black Thighs, for the queer content director for Black Thighs. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Cool, thank you. All right, so with that being said, in your capacity, why is representation so important? How do we define representation, and why is it so important?
I think, the representation conversation is one of twofold, because if we're going to talk about representation, it means that I want to see myself in certain media outlets. But then if I'm going to see myself in certain media outlets, then it means I need to look a specific way. And then that could be further just a little bit detrimental, because then it means that I need to be this sort of way, like how I'm represented has to look a certain way, which could be damaging as well as uplifting in the same sentence.
All right, so in a moment we're going to have a little look at a video from Lilo. He is a blogger who does a lot of important and very interesting work on just queer narratives, and he'll be letting us know, he'll be giving us a little bit of insight into the topic before we get into it in a little bit. When we return, we'll have a look at what representation does for minorities and for stereotypes.
It's half past high time that we have a frank conversation about the relationship South African mass media has with queerness. South African mass media has an irresponsibly poor relationship with queer folk, and there are two faulty areas within this relationship that I'd like to speak about today. The first is the manner in which South African mass media has constructed the ideal queer being. The second is the manner in which and through which South African mass media engages issues of representation. Because of democracy, South African mass media had to learn how to function within a neoliberal, free market capitalist society, which meant that institutions within South African mass media were mandated to now visibilize people who were previously marginalized and portray those people as a significant part of the Rainbow Nation project and narrative. Now, in order to lure audiences and parties that have got the shmoney into the idea of a worthy queer being in a democratic context, South African mass media did the following. They first constructed this being as polarizingly gay. But now there's a race problem, because the strong majority of this country is black. So the construction of a gay black figure is not only necessary, that figure has to be constructed in a way that has the power to influence and represent as many aspects of free life in South Africa as possible. So this gay black figure has to demonstrate a meaningful contribution to society in order to seek the economic, social, and political validation as a worthy citizen in this country. When I look at the way this country has embraced figures like, Bougie, Amstel, Somizi, Lasizwe, it reminds me of how the fixation and the romanticization of gay boys and gay men in this country is an important part of social nostalgia. And it is this very romanticization and fixation and nostalgia with gay boys that oils the machine that is South African mass media, because we are the audience. So here we are. On the one hand, we have a particular queer being that's been constructed by South African mass media for various reasons that I've just discussed. And on the other hand, you have this fixational nostalgia of this queer being that is happening at a grassroots level of the socio-economic and cultural sphere. And these two hands work together to perpetuate the same set of narratives about the same kind of queer being. The collusion that is going on here has three implications for queerness in this country. The first implication is the tokenization and the totalization of queer narratives and identities in this country. Because South African mass media and society in general have been conditioned to seeing a certain kind of queer figure tell a certain kind of story over and over, society is then led to believe that other forms of queerness and other queer narratives are illegitimate or are deviant. The second implication has to do with the evident exclusion of other queer identities that have emerged over the recent years. Society, mass media, institutions like the Film and Publication Board had the power to frame the film in a way that delegitimized queer experiences, especially in the realms of culture. South African mass media in the Department of Representation has really proven itself as incompetent and incapable of engaging queer identities and narratives and experiences in ways that are meaningful, in ways that are impactful, but also in ways that matter. And because of this incapability, South African mass media, I guess, in an attempt to brand itself as concerned and caring, creates the buzzword activism. Whether it is said in speech or visuals, whether it is implied or explicit, many, if not most queers that mass media lends itself to are labeled activists. And so it is this activism narrative that is strategically used by South African mass media to pacify a conservative society like ours. I made this episode because I believe deeply in holding people and institutions and systems accountable for the ways in which queer people continue to be shortchanged in this country.
So now that we've had a look at Lelo Macheka's insights, the suburban Zulu, let's ask Lelethu, here in studio with us, like we said, what does representation do for minorities and for stereotypes?
Representation in the bigger grand scheme of things is basically saying you can be exactly whoever you want to be because, oh, so-and-so did it. It's also then saying, oh my gosh, I see myself in this way or represented in this way. So it is very important, especially for people who are not seen in media and people who are not really seen as well in real life and people who have to hide their identities and hide who they are. They have, in representation, they have that opportunity to actually relate to someone else other than themselves who's also going through that same experience. Okay, not the same experience, but a similar experience to what they potentially could be going through.
So earlier on you said that what representation does is that, or the lack of representation, what it does is that it kind of restricts us as to what we're supposed to sound like, what we're supposed to look like.
Yes.
So how does that come about? What does representation do for constructing our identities?
So you see, it's such a big conversation because ideally I'm saying, oh my goodness, yes, I definitely want to be seen and I see myself in this way. But then in seeing that way, especially with queer persons, the bisexual will look a certain way, the lesbian will look a certain way, the gay man will look a certain way, a trans person will look a certain way. And then now we are sort of put into a corner of, all right, so because a lesbian woman looks this way, then it means that I need to be the same way, and then if I'm not, then I'm cast out of this box that is supposed to represent me. So it's important in a way that, yes, absolutely, I can see myself, I see myself, it's great, but then also this myselfness is then constructed into a particular worldview. And then when we speak about queer identities, people have this notion that they then enforce their heteronormative ideals on it. So yes, the lesbian woman will look a certain way, but then and then you get these silly questions on, oh, but who's the man and who's the woman? Yet it's two women who are in love with each other, but you still ask such a heteronormative question, meaning that although I could have representation, it is ideally fueled by heteronormative gaze. And the media also does that in a way of, there's so much scrutiny that goes into a relationship, especially a queer relationship. I remember watching Society, I think it was called, and for the first time, I think I was in high school at this time, and I had a black woman who was a lesbian. I think Beth. Her character name was Beth, and she played being a teacher. And it was so important to me to have this black woman, powerful, you know, very much in love with her job, and also very good in her job, but then also navigating, you know, the whole coming out, which is not a real thing, because nobody owes you coming out. Nobody owes to be like, oh, by the way, no, I'm gay, or I'm, you know, this. And it was so important for me to see myself in that light. And previously, when we think about queer narratives or queer storylines, historically they've always been wrapped around a certain ideal. So if it's not HIV and AIDS, it's rape, you know, it's trauma, you know. It's never just like a healthy, good relationship that we see and that we can. So now already, yes, of course we are represented, and it's amazing, it's beautiful, but we also represent it in a way that now has to be palatable. And I really, I don't like that, because
what does that look like?
Exactly. That was going to be my next thing. Who is palatable? You know, even as heterosexual persons, nobody puts on you if you're palatable or not. You're out here existing your life, existing and just doing whatever you want to do. But because I'm a lesbian woman, I need to be a certain way. I need to be palatable. I can't be too loud. I can't be too forceful. I can't wear pants all the time, or else I'm masculine. I can't wear skirts unless I'm feminine, you know? And even like these boxes that we put ourselves in also just go down to further scrutiny.
All right, I think that we have definitely gotten into a lot of information here. So we're going to take a bit of a ad break, and when we come back, we'll unravel all of these things a little bit more. Welcome back to it. You are watching Free Media, Free Minds, and we are looking at queer representation within African media and how that affects our own construction of identity. So with me still is Leletu, and we are speaking, like I said, we are speaking identity creation. So looking at, you know, coming out of '94, South Africa, the South African media, mass media, has had to construct a certain kind of, like we said, palatable queer body or queer experience or queer narrative. What does that look like?
So the queer body in media, one, is very, you see, I can't actually pinpoint it to be one exact person, because of course we've had like a lot of variations of queer people personage, and I like that, not even post '94, but like, let's say around 2006, 2008, the narrative started moving from this HIV, you know, narrative to people just actually living their lives and doing everyday things, working and being, you know, people in the community that just like everybody else, but the queer persons in media is still quite exclusionary, because there is not a lot of trans person visibility. We haven't been able to sort of represent bisexual persons as well in a very healthy way, and not in a way to like induce conversations of like derogatory speech, like, you know, whatever they say about bisexual like persons, as well as trans people, and some, oh no, you know, it wants to be a man, or, you know, nobody is actually born a man or a woman. You know, we are all socialized into our genders, regardless of our biology. So I think we're lacking there in those areas, but this person is still very mainstream. So in terms of body positivity as well. This person's always, you know, looks a certain way, is not like a, I don't want to say an everyday body, because everybody's body is an everyday body.
Yeah.
But it's a body that would be, I'm trying to be PC about it, but I don't know.
Don't be PC.
But okay, so for example, fat women, you know, my girls are not shown in the media. Like, you know, like we don't have our own love story, you know. We're always the fat friend, you know. Our storyline still exists as the friend of the main character, and the main character has to look a certain way. Whereas it's like, oh, and then they started doing this thing that I just can't stand, where they just like drop a gay person there. So it's like, oh yeah, and then you just see them holding hands, and it's like, oh, so that's the representation, and then that's it, you know. We don't actually have any leading roles where we can say, okay, this is our story, this is our lived experiences, and we're not palatable, you know, like we are showing real life cases.
Would you say that perhaps social media has aided in us extending representation, or having more to draw on in terms of representation after, as you said, 2006, 2007, with, you know, the booming of Instagram, for example? We now, as minority groups, can also be like, I am also a person. This is my story. This is, so that in its, would you say that that in its own also has contributed towards?
I think the amazing thing that social media has done is it's given everybody a fair opportunity to tell their story. Because you could do it via Instagram story, you could do it via your tweets, your Facebook post, you know, you get to share a percentage of who you are to the world on your own accord, on your own, you know, on your own doing, and that's really great. But then what happens is that the people who have the power, I don't know who these people are, but then they pinpoint, you know, the more acceptable gay, the more acceptable lesbian, the more acceptable bisexual persons, and then they decide, oh, okay, so this is the story that we're going to tell because, you know, it's good. And I definitely understand the need to believe in everybody's rights and, you know, everybody, you know, but something that people don't understand is that if your right or your belief or whatever you're doing in your life is infringing in my expression of myself, that is not okay. And the one thing that's really great about Black Thighs is what we do is, so we try to give, we prioritize women, and in women we say cis, non-binary, you know, whichever way.
Can you explain that for the viewers, actually? Cis, non-binary, all of these terms.
So, I hate having to do that. Okay, so for example, a cis heterosexual person would be somebody who is born as whatever sex they are, and they live in that sex, and so you're a woman, you live as a woman, you know, you represent as a woman or a man. A person who's non-binary is a person who has not really chosen, I don't want to use that kind of word, but it is a person who doesn't subscribe to any sort of gender. So they exist in the space where they can be either or nothing at the same time. Trans folk are people who are, I don't want to say not comfortable in their body, but they represent, they don't feel the socialization of gender that we would ascribe them to be. So for example, if you don't feel like a woman or you are not a woman, then and it doesn't even have to transition, like you don't have to transition, but you could just be trans-identifying in that, in the way that you relate or someone must relate to you. They shouldn't assign a gender no matter what you look like. I hope I said that right.
No, that makes 100% makes sense. So I really think that there's a deeper lying issue here. I think that it's not just about whether or not we're seeing queer people on TV. I think it's about who is calling the shots as to why we are not seeing those people. Who are these people? Who are these people in power? Do we know, and why?
I have no idea who are the people in power, because I think every institution or every sector has the people that, you know, they have to represent to. And it's one thing for our constitution to say, yes, you know, you cannot discriminate somebody due to their sexual orientation or gender or belief, but it's another thing for people to actually put structures in place that make it safe for me to exist in any space, you know. And at the end of the day, as I said before, nobody owes you coming out.
Yeah.
Like, nobody really owes you saying, oh no, I'm the gay here, so you can use me in this way. But regardless of what it is, it has to be a safe space. Not a safe space, there's nothing called a safe space. But there has to be a space where no matter how different I am, no matter how same I am, I feel that in this particular space, whichever way I navigate my life, it's okay.
Yeah.
And it won't be a conversation or a whisper or anything. Whoever the people are who I empower, it's one thing to be like, oh, but you guys are free now. Like, you have your rights, you know, like, you're not getting killed anymore. We are actually still getting killed. And low-key, yeah, we're all still getting killed. And even though there's, like, representation, it's a catch-22 in a way. It's a catch-22, and it's, yeah.
Okay, so as we begin to wrap up, what types of issues do we face because of this lack of representation? At the end of the day, what is the problem?
I mean, it's an identity thing, as we're trying to thread out in this conversation, that especially nowadays, you know, we watch movies, we watch series, we watch, you know, and we do this thing, it's human nature, where we relate so much to so-and-so in a character and so-and-so. And the nice thing about today's, like, day and age is that children are growing up and they're seeing themselves, you know, in various lights, but not just for children as well, but for adults who missed the opportunity to be exactly who they wanted to be. They're starting to change their lives and saying, okay, so, I mean, I saw it this way, you know, and so it's a thing, you know. But there is a danger of making this palatable queer person into one thing, you know. And I think what we need is more variation. We need to be represented more across all spheres, and it shouldn't just be like a drop of a backstory and there's no substance in that character or in that person. Ooh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So Lilith is speaking to us about how identity, or rather how representation, allows us to make very selective decisions on how we choose to build our own identity. All right, so we say thanks to her in a little bit. We'll take a little bit of an ad break, and when we come back, we'll get into our Skype interview after this. Welcome to it. You are still tuned into Free Media, Free Minds. And in a little bit, we'll speak to Annette from Love Matters joining us on Skype. All right, Annette, we're officially live. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're joining us from, and about your organization?
So my name is Annette Etieno. I have 4+ years of experience in strategic communications with a focus on LGBTIQ issues in Kenya. I currently work for Love Matters Kenya, as I would say Africa. I currently work for Love Matters Kenya as an online moderator.
All right, fantastic. So can you tell us a little bit about how your work advances the lives of LGBTQIA+ people?
So my work so far, because when you say advances the lives of LGBTIQ people, it feels like such a grand task, eh? So what I'm trying to do is just like through strategic communications, especially in and around the Repeal 162 case, is just try to educate the public on what the case is about, what it's not about. Also just try and equip the community with the skills and the information they need to make informed decisions around the case, and also just like, you know, live, how would I put it, like lives that are more aware of the situation. That's what I want to say, and just like make sure that everyone that is, like, make sure that the community members are as safe as possible, because safety is a really big issue.
All right, okay, so if we look at South Africa, I think that it is quite progressive compared to other countries in the world, or at least other countries on the continent. And it was the first country to actually legalize same-sex marriages. But, I mean, considering that, are we as progressive as we seem on paper?
I feel like South Africa is a really good example of how things can go wrong, right? Because on paper it's really fantastic, but like I feel like there's a lot of attacks and there's a lot of
Yes.
like the community itself isn't safe, and that's just a really good example of how things can be great on paper, but like in reality, like on the ground, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, especially around sensitization and just like, you know what I mean? So I think that a lot of countries have looked at South Africa as an example of how great it could be, but also how terrible things could go.
Definitely. So if we do look at the rest of Africa, how do you think we're faring in terms of protecting and defending queer rights? Is there progression, or would you say we're stagnant?
So I feel like there's with every year there's progression almost everywhere, right? So when it comes to human rights, right? We want to say that like we are like there's like, for example, we'd say that there's a shrinking of civil space, but there's been progress made, right? And I feel like little by little the organizations in South Africa are making a great impact, and that is really important. And sometimes when everything is going wrong, it's hard to see the things that are going right.
Definitely. So if we bring this back to the media, can you tell us how discrimination against queer folk play out on media or on social media?
So I will talk about the Kenyan context and the work that I've done with media people in Kenya. The thing is that the media plays a really big role in Kenya, especially traditional media. Social media also plays a really, important role in its own right. And I feel like in terms of discrimination is that when stories are told that are not that are one very, very what's the word I'm looking for? That are very biased, right? And when you can tell the writer's bias, and when there's no effort to seek comments from organizations or from people from the community, then we carry like it causes this cause and effect, right? And so the people who are reading the story get the tone in the story, right? And they pick up from there, right? But also, if the stories that are being told are never positive, if the stories that are being told are just never really giving the correct information. I remember just after the case, one newspaper, a very large newspaper, posted that the case was about, Repeal 162 case was about gay marriage when it was not, right? It has never been about that, but that was carried in the newspaper, and that became the narrative. And unfortunately, even in the ruling that was given for the case, something about gay marriage was mentioned, and at no point was that an argument that was presented. So you see, the media plays a really big role.
Yeah. All right, so if we do look at the law, if we do have a look at the law in South Africa and in other African countries, how does the law protect us from hate speech targeting queer people?
The thing is, right now, this is really interesting that you asked this, because I had a conversation with a friend of mine, and he was saying how not only does there need to be decriminalization, but there needs to be a law that protects people. So a law that protects human rights and protects people, especially that is specifically worded for LGBTIQ persons, right?
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, right now we're just decriminalization is just one step of a very long journey, right? And unfortunately, right now a lot of countries aren't at the stage where they're talking about protections for LGBTIQ people. They're just talking about decriminalization, which is sad, really, to still be doing this in 2019, right? But so then LGBTIQ persons find protections that are already in place within the law, right? So in Kenya, we would rely on the law that speaks about hate speech. And because it's worded in a way that it protects everyone, then we would like to include ourselves in the everyone, right? But the truth is that right now, a lot of countries, especially in the African continent, do not have specific protections for LGBTIQ people.
Yeah, and I think this definitely filters down to very real life, everyday situations. So then, how do you suggest? I mean, in your small capacity, how do you suggest we address social attitudes against the queer community?
The thing is, the work has to be done. There's no
Yeah.
shortcut. There's no.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's no one way of doing it. So what works in South Africa might not work here. What works in, Angola might not work here. So the work has to be done, and I feel like civil societies, LGBTIQ, ITGNC, everyone who's in this fight is actually doing a lot of work on the ground when it comes to sensitization, especially with, the general public, but also with politicians and also, politicians and policymakers, but also with religious leaders who also play a really big role in shaping public opinion in Kenya and, in Africa, as it were. So I feel like a lot of work has been done when it comes to sensitization, and just like there's still a lot more work to be done, but the work is being done, and I think every country has its own formula and its own way of doing it.
Definitely, I think that we also we have to take things into our own hands as well, and we can't just depend on governments and NGOs to do the work for us. So I think one tool that we do have to aid this, normalization, if you will, of queer persons is social media. So is social media a safe place for interactions and connectedness of queer rights?
Yes and no, right?
Yes.
So the thing about social media is, first of all, when you talk about safe spaces, what is a safe space and how safe is a space, right? And so also looking at places like, let's say, Uganda and Egypt, where not specific to LGBTIQ issues, but also just like how the government has been able to very quickly seize the airwaves, or just like shut stuff off, right? And so social media is safe in that it provides much needed anonymity on some level, but also you're only anonymous for as long as you want, like for as long as the person looking for you wants you to be anonymous, right? So you're just one Google search away from, someone finding out where you live, your phone number, etc., right? And so social media is great in that it allows, especially here in Kenya, what I've seen and what I've observed is that it's allowed for online movement building, which is fantastic, and it's aggressive and it's beautiful, especially around just like feminism, but also around LGBTIQ rights and also around LBQ movement building. But also that is also its danger on some level, is that you're only anonymous for as long as somebody wants you to be anonymous, and then if they really want to find you, then they could, right? And like just like what I was saying, like it's safe, but it's not. It's a double-edged sword, I feel.
Okay.
It's a great tool.
So considering what you just said, can you maybe give us an example of how social media has been used to advance the rights of LGBTQIA+ communities?
Wow. So the example I will give, of course, is Kenyan, is around when there was the case, the Repeal 162 case. I keep speaking about this case as if you know about it.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, so the Repeal 162 case, so the Penal Code of Kenya has section 162A and C and section 165, which basically criminalizes homosexual acts, right? And so 162C talks about gross indecency, which could mean basically anything, but it talks about these acts between men, right?
Okay.
And then 165 then talks about the jail terms for these acts. And so although the law isn't specific in its wording, the law has been used to specifically target LGBTQ persons and IGNC persons. And so the only people so far that we know of that have been convicted under this law have been LGBTQ and ITGNC persons. And so the people who went, so there's some organizations that went to court. There were two cases, but they were merged into one. Basically said that this law is unconstitutional, right? And so it had, and because it is unconstitutional, they were seeking to have it scrapped from the penal code. And so on May 27th of this year, we were called for the ruling, and unfortunately the ruling was not in our favor, or rather in favor of the community. And so basically we're back to the drawing board, because one of the the effects of this law is that it causes serious like it leads to violence being visited upon members of the community, and violence in all shapes and forms, up to and including murder. And so, and it also is used as a justification for violence against LGBTQ people. But so now around the case and leading up to the case, LGBTQ and ITGNC organizations in Kenya ran a campaign on Twitter with the hashtag #Repeal162. And the beauty of this is that, one, it gave information to the community that needed it about their rights and about the case and what's going on. Two, it also, the community was also able to reach out to its allies, and also allies that did not know what to do or how to help, right? Were able to, get information and really come on board and offer their support in the best way they could. Two. Three, it also garnered, public interest, right? The thing about LGBTIQ issues is that, unfortunately or fortunately, it's really still emotive in Kenya, right? And so, but the conversation needs to be had, and this is part of sensitization, right? And so, the hashtag, which trended for very many days, was able to begin a conversation, a much larger conversation that is still ongoing, and is still being used to date. And so that's one of the ways in which that social media has worked for the community.
All right, so Annette, as we begin to wrap up, the film Ingleba depicted a gay relationship in a traditional context, and it aroused many comments and backlash from traditional leaders. So very quickly, what does that say about the law versus the attitudes of ordinary people?
I feel like, that film, I don't have the right, I can't say it well. So that film and Rafiki on our end really, one, again, very much like the hashtag, one, helped the community identify its allies. Two, help the community identify what I would say, I don't want to say enemies, but just like people of interest, people who would need to be, maybe like people who just don't know, but want to be part of the conversation, right? And who to have a conversation with, right? And who not to talk to completely. And I feel like the law, one of the things about Ep3 and why we believed we had such a strong case is that the Constitution of Kenya 2010 is a very well-written constitution, right? And we felt that the law should reflect our constitution, right? And so countries like, in this case, South Africa and Kenya have laws that are really well written, but maybe implementation is just, it's not, the people who are supposed to be implementing it are just not as well meaning, or people just come in with their biases, right? And so these are the conversations that need to be had. This is the situation in which we are. And I feel like the good thing about art is that it's a great conversation starter. And both films have been great in starting conversations. And these conversations are continuing in various ways. But also the beauty of it is that they're offering information and education, which in the end provides, a pseudo-safe space in some ways for some people, especially for young people who, one, want to see themselves represented in art. Two, want to know how to navigate, this world that is so, cruel and violent towards them, right? And so it's offering language, it's giving language. It's giving language to people who had none or didn't have enough to describe who they are, what they're going through. And that also is really, really important, I feel.
All right. Okay, thank you so much, Annette. I think it is really important to kind of make people uncomfortable when we're trying to make change. I don't think that
Yes.
change comes from a place of comfort. All
course
right,
not.
but fantastic. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Annette. Hopefully we'll catch you a little bit later on in the season if that's possible. But thank you for chatting to us, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. This was fantastic.
All right, goodbye. We'll take a little bit of an ad break to pay the bills, and when we come back, we'll get into our community notice board.
RICA is the law that regulates monitoring and control of the airwaves. A part of RICA is the fact that you have to register your SIM card so that people are supposed to know who is using a cell phone. But the parts of RICA that we attacked in our court application had to do with the rights it gives to state officials to intercept communications. And the other part of the story is there's another practice which the intelligence services carry out, which is called bulk interception, which is interception on a very large scale, sort of Snowden type of interception. And in their practice, if there is one leg of that communication outside of the country, then their view was that they can do it without any kind of permission from a judge or anybody else. And that may have been semi-justifiable, 17 years ago when this law was first written. And up to now, the intelligence services have taken the view that they can intercept those signals without permission from anybody. And we attacked that because we argued that there's no law in South African law which permits them to do that. And the judge ruled in our favor on that as well. So there were various areas of weaknesses in RICA, which is a piece of legislation for, in a sense, targeted surveillance. When you target a person or a particular number of people or specific phone numbers and so on, we said there were some weaknesses in the protections in that legislation. And then there was the bulk interception, where we said, there's no protections built in because in fact there's no law which governs it. So those were the two areas that we took on. I mean, the purpose is, every state and every police service needs to have powers to intercept communications. It's a very important investigation tool. It's a very important tool for gathering intelligence, etc. But it's also a tool which is very easily open to abuse because it is so powerful, and because especially now we live so much of our lives online, that there, at least even back in 2002, there was understanding that there needs to be a law which regulates on what basis the state may do that. And RICA is that law, and it makes various provisions. There are various levels, but to do what is called real-time interception, in other words, of actual data and voice and so on, there needs to be a case made out to a judge. It's in secret. There is a specific judge called the designated judge, and that was part of the problem, because in the legislation, the designated judge is a retired judge who's chosen by the minister. And we argued that undermines his independence. So he becomes, at least, from the point of view of perception, open to, in a sense, institutional capture by the minister or by the intelligence services, and maybe he doesn't apply his mind independently. So in our case, the judge who heard our case agreed that was a weakness, and found that that was one aspect that needed to be fixed. The biggest problem with RICA, and it was one of our main areas of attack, is when a judge grants a search warrant for a physical search, he also does that in secret. The police go to him, they don't tell the person they want to search, because that would defeat the object of the exercise. So it's a surprise. But when the police pitch up based on a search warrant and conduct a search, then you find out about it, and then you can challenge that search warrant. You can say, but what the police said to the judge, in terms of, on the basis of which he granted this search warrant wasn't true, or they gave wrong facts, or they gave the wrong address, or something. But when it comes to surveillance and interception, that's like a very intrusive search, in some ways even more intrusive than somebody coming into your office or your house, but certainly as intrusive. But you never know about it, because you never get informed, and it's never apparent to you. There are not telltale signs. So you can never go back and say, you've been listening to my phone conversations. On what basis did you do that? What was the justification? Did the judge exercise his discretion correctly in granting permission for you to do that? You can never validate your constitutional right to privacy, because you don't know that it's been invaded. We knew that my communications had been monitored for about 6 months. We had proof of that. There should be notification when it's no longer going to interfere with the investigation. And the baseline that he set was 90 days after the surveillance or the interception has taken place. The authorities who conducted that must notify you that they did that. Obviously, there are going to be some investigations and some circumstances where, for reasons of security and compromising the investigation, it's not appropriate, even after 90 days, to tell somebody that you've been monitoring them. But in terms of the interim arrangements that the judge put in place, he made provision for that time period. One of the other issues that we raised around RICA is there's nothing in the legislation which sets out what must happen in order to protect the information gathered in terms of an interception order. So there's nothing which says how it must be stored, who may see it, what records must be kept, about who sees it, about whether it's copied. There's nothing in the legislation about if it's found that there was absolutely nothing, that it must be destroyed and there must be proof of its destruction, etc. So yes, my phone was listened to, I think my emails were intercepted for about 6 months, and that's an enormous amount of my private and professional life that theory is in the possession of the state. What have they done with it? Who has access to it? Can somebody use it against me in some way? So those are some of the concerns we had, which is why we went to court in, I think, April 2017, and we had judgment on Monday this week, a slam dunk judgment in our favor, although we understand that the Department of Justice and the State Security Agency and others will appeal. For everyday citizens, it means that at least there will be a record that starts getting produced of who is intercepted. At least in terms of official monitoring and surveillance, we'll start to get a picture of what the state is doing. It's not going to work retrospectively, but it will work going forward, as assuming it doesn't get overturned on appeal. When we started this case in 2017, April, more than 2 years ago, they admitted there were problems with RICA. They said no, they were setting about drafting a new law. More than 2 years later, they don't even have a draft bill on the table, that there's no law that allows you to do this. And in our country, essentially all state power flows from the law, and the state's not allowed to do things that are not enabled by law. So we've, the intelligence services are really on the back foot, and we'll have to see what they come up with now. We have to, and the population as a whole, we have to make sure that the state uses it for the common good rather than for control. And part of achieving that aim is to have much more transparency about what's going on. I think that, in a sense, this is about the state, but we have huge global private players who know, almost everything about us as well, to try to manipulate us. Where the technology has reached a point where you can monitor whole population and you can target them with information, you target individuals with information on the basis of that monitoring and on the basis of very complex computer programs that are, going to get even more insightful. That does, in a sense, radically change the balance of power between the individual and the big brother machine. And we really have to confront that, because I do think we're in the very early stages of this. And what's already come out around Brexit, around the election of Trump, etc., is that potentially these tools are very, very powerful, and they can have a political...
This is unfortunately all that we have time for this evening, but do keep the conversation going on our social media platforms. If you have missed the show, you can catch it on YouTube right after it's aired, but you can catch us at freemedia.freeminds on Instagram or Free Media Free Minds on Facebook. Make sure to participate in our weekly polls that come out every single week on a Monday, and that way you can participate in the show before it's even aired. So thank you so much to Leletu for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Cool. We will hopefully have her back in studio again at a later stage later on in the season. So from me, Chelsea Noah Ogilvie, good night.